Welcome to False Dichotomy. I'm Cy Castells.
I'm Daria Quinn.
And we're going to be talking about pop culture and feminism and trans issues and politics in general. I think it'll be a lot of fun. What do you think?
Oh, I think that hopefully this will help encourage adult conversations about difficult subjects. And when I mean adult conversations, I mean respectful discourse, not necessarily, swear words and stuff.
Yeah, mature conversations
yes.
about dicks and
what it's like to have one and not want it, or the opposite.
Yeah. There's a lot of stuff that we're into. There's a wide variety of genres and media that we're into. Although Daria and I are friends, we would like to be closer friends.
Right.
And we don't have a lot in common in terms of the media that we consume. So we're hoping to introduce each other to some new media or old new media, new old media or thereabouts, and talk about it and maybe have some really interesting conversations along the way.
Something that concerns me about society is that we consume a lot of media, a lot of entertainment, but we don't think about it. We don't analyze it. We don't take in the repercussions it has on other people. There's no sense of context. People don't want to confront the problematic elements of things they love.
Yeah. And
when you do, you're being accused of hating on it or trying to tell people not to enjoy it or whatever else. And it's like, I don't want to come on here and take away this thing that you care about. Mm-hmm. But I do want you to think about the context, because context is important, and we're not going to get better as a society until we start taking responsibility for our fiction, essentially.
Absolutely. One thing that I kind of suffer from personally is the fact that the media and the stories that are very special to me are not necessarily ones that everybody knows about. Mm-hmm. I have very niche interests. I'm kind of a geek among geeks, you might say, because the things that I'm into are things that very few people even know about. And to me, that has led to, quite often, I'll have a very complex thought, and I want to allude to a story that I read when I was a kid or as an adult, and I realize nobody that I know has ever read that. So hopefully this can ameliorate some of that isolation with each other. Maybe get a conversation going about some of the lesser known works that have been part of our lives.
I think also for me, sometimes I kind of feel like the dumbass among my friends. not necessarily because I don't have the education that most of them have or anything, but because I'm into this, universally derided stupid stuff, like say pro wrestling. Which is something I will probably be subjecting Cy to in the future.
Oh yes, I'm looking forward to it.
I don't know. But that's the sort of thing is, I'm the kind of person that feels like even the most mainstream things have an artistic value, something to it that shouldn't just be written off as frivolous entertainment. Especially if it's something that's asking a lot of you emotionally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that as well. I'm definitely the kind of person who thinks about the broader social implications of the top 50 pop songs. Mm-hmm. Although they very, very rarely end up being my favorite music. Probably should have put this on the list, but I have this fascinating theory that Titanic is ultimately an anti-capitalist movie. And I think there's an excellent case to be made for that. Well,
you really take a look at almost anything, you can make that kind of an argument. That's the other thing about these kind of conversations, the idea that we're trying to smash these false dichotomies.
Oh yeah,
That's where you got the name from.
Exactly. Yeah, they're like the dichotomy between high art and low art, between popular culture and niche culture, between male and female, between the mainstream and the fringe.
And we both have a very big personal stake in this as well.
Yes. So I am a transgender guy who's kind of gender queer, actually. I use they, them, or he, him pronouns. And I've been out and transitioning for about 2.5 years now. How about you?
I'm Daria Quinn. I am trans feminine. I'm using she and her pronouns. And I have been living as Daria since March of 2017.
Good job. So yeah, we've got a lot riding on this massive political debate that's been going on across the world.
Oh yeah.
And although I've noticed there's a lot of pop culture commentary that deals with political issues, not a lot of it is coming from people with our particular perspective.
And when they are, they're being buried.
Yes. I know, in fact, some of the most popular pop culture commentators that I know of who are coming from a feminist or leftist position are quite often cis men.
Yeah.
Not to devalue their contributions. Some of my absolute favorite people in the world, I'm going to name drop H-Bomber Guy,
Okay.
Philosophy Tube, Movie Bob, who is probably the first media critic that I really got into. A couple of others we could probably name. Yeah, it's a very cis male dominated field. So I think that we have something to offer.
Yeah. I feel like, there is that sort of lack of representation, but even more so for people in the trans community, for people who don't necessarily identify as strictly male or strictly female. You're identifying mostly as gender queer these days?
Yeah, although I'm getting used to... At the beginning, I was pretty sure that I was, strictly androgynous. But as I've gotten further into my transition and gone on hormones and started passing more as male, I've noticed that I'm much more comfortable using he, him pronouns than I used to be. So I'm not sure where I'm going to end up in the next few years of my life. But right now, I'm still pretty much non-binary. I still like to present a little bit more femininely than your typical dude. But I'm also pretty okay with being considered a guy if that's what the situation calls for.
For me, it was for a long time I was convinced, no, I'm straight up full on trans woman. And then the prospect of physical transition and what that would undertake started kind of getting to me. And I don't hate everything about my body. I don't like aspects of it. I do wish I was more feminine. I do wish that there was certain things that shouldn't be there. But at the same time, part of transition for a lot of people is learning to adopt new social roles.
Yes.
And my feminism is rooted in refusing to do so. So there is that sort of internal war of, well, you're trans feminine, right? So why don't you want to do this and that, And it's because I shouldn't have to.
That's an excellent point. And someone in a position like that has very few options in the world right now, because even in the trans community, there's relentless pressure to prioritize your presentation.
Yeah.
Not necessarily in all trans communities, but in general, there's a great danger that you can be invalidated if you don't want to look binary. And and I've encountered that too, not to a much lesser extent, I think, than a lot of trans women. But for instance, I have long hair, and currently it's in a French braid, which is
pretty cool.
Yeah, I think I rock it. I also have facial hair. I think that a lot of people assume that if you're trans, you're going to look conventionally masculine or feminine. And that's another thing. So I have been a feminist for most of my life. I was raised by a feminist mother, and that's part of why I had a really hard time coming to terms with my trans identity, because every part of me that did not want to conform to feminine stereotypes from my feminist upbringing told me, great, so don't conform to the feminist stereotypes. You're still a woman.
Right.
And it took me a long time to figure out that I could vehemently reject every aspect of conventional femininity and still be unhappy being a woman. And that's why it took me until I was almost 30 before I came out. At least one of the reasons. And when I did, a lot of my feminist friends did come forward and say, but why can't you just be a masculine woman? And I was like, the thing is, at my most masculine presenting, I wanted to be feminine, but I didn't want to be a woman. What I wanted to be was a feminine guy, in as many words. So that's why the binary really does not do me any good. And it seems that's something that we definitely agree on.
I'm finding the further along I am in being Daria, the less gender matters. And unfortunately, the world is not coming along with me on that journey.
Well, we're working on that.
But there is this false notion that there's only a one or the other. And it's like, well, there's clearly a both and an either.
Absolutely.
And that's the oversimplified version of it. Nothing has an easy answer.
Yeah.
And people want to avoid that. They don't want to, the conventional wisdom is that you don't talk about sex, politics, or religion.
Yeah.
We're probably going to do all of that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
We're going to piss some of you off.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And if you decide you're never going to listen to us again, I'm like, well, okay, we probably are better off parting ways.
Yeah. I think that ultimately we'll have a lot of good things to say as well, and I think that it's not all going to be trash talk. There's going to be a little bit of trash talk, but ultimately we're talking about media and stories that we love. And even when it has problematic elements.
Which everything does.
Absolutely. We're going to be able to look at those problematic elements, figure out what's wrong with them, and then be able to turn around and say, but I still love this story, or I still love this media, and come to terms with some of that tension.
And I think too, this will probably be later on once we're more established, but we might be able to start talk about things that we kind of fell out of love with.
Yes.
Yeah. And a good example for me is South Park.
Oh, yes. I agree with that one.
Yeah, because it's like, I'm this angry, supposedly white. Oh, okay, I am white, but I mean supposedly cisgender boy. And this cartoon comes out where there's no limits. There's everything is on the table, and they will destroy everything. Well, there's a problem with that mindset. Eventually, they're going to hit a sacred cow that's important to you. And for me, and this was retroactively, because a lot of it was something I internalized when I wasn't able to come to terms with my own identity, was the Mrs. Garrison story arc, where Mr. Garrison transitions into Mrs. Garrison. And in that episode, there's a lot of problematic elements to it, but Mr. Garrison transitions into Mrs. Garrison. And this opens a door for Kyle Broflovsky, was like, oh, I identify as a tall black basketball player. So they take this small Jewish boy and transition him into a black basketball player. And that's not the most egregious part, though. The most egregious part is Kyle's dad, who transitions into a dolphin.
Into a dolphin, yes, I remember. Oh, wow.
And this is just one episode.
Can you... I'm surprised nobody was turned into an attack helicopter.
I don't know if they thought of that at the time, man. I don't think the attack helicopter thing was a meme back then.
Yeah, they were not that ahead of their time.
But the ending thing about it was Kyle wasn't actually a tall basketball player, so the parts that made him that failed on him when he tried to play basketball. Yeah. It was just cosmetic. So their message was that Garrison's transition, which was sudden and out of nowhere and done with very little thought, even on the character's part, is, this is just a cosmetic change, and you should really just be happy with yourself. And then they spend the next 2 seasons with Garrison going through a bunch of... Mrs. Garrison ends up becoming Mr. Garrison again.
Yes. Detransitioning.
Yeah. But in probably the most damaging way possible for an audience to see a transgender narrative.
Absolutely. And what it reminds me of is this pervasive notion, and I'm not saying that South Park invented this idea, but it definitely encouraged it with that episode and that story arc. And that is the idea that when a trans person seeks medical transitioning, they haven't thought it through, and that they are not educated on the consequences. I seem to remember there was a scene where she is surprised that she hasn't had her period, and when she finds out that if she hasn't had her period, that if she were cis would mean that she might be pregnant, she decides that she's pregnant. And the idea of any trans woman being that ignorant of biology, it's astounding. First of all, there's no doctor in the world who would provide hormones or surgery to a trans person without discussing at great lengths
for years
the consequences of those procedures or those treatments. And on top of that, usually, almost every trans person I know, most of them, before they even make an appointment with a doctor, they have already done so much research on their own. And this is only increased with the internet becoming available and trans people talking about their transitions to other trans people. It's not uncommon for instance, if someone is going in for hormone therapy, for the patient to be more informed than their doctor about the potential effects of those hormones. One of the doctors that I've gone to in this journey told me that his trans patients are usually really well informed. This might come as a shock to some cis people, but trans people tend to take their time thinking about transitioning, and it sort of becomes an obsession sometimes, where it's we will lose sleep over it, reading about things. So the point I'm making is that Mrs. Garrison's transition was not in any way representative of a transition. And yeah, it's a cartoon. It's meant to be absurd. But in the absence of realistic narratives in the media, people are going to assume that the only story of a trans person they have seen is representative. And there's a terrible epidemic of straw manning and straw womaning of the trans community in these media.
And the concerning thing about it to me is, I know on a visceral level the South Park audience. Because, not only because I was part of it, but because I was, actively a part of intersecting fandoms, primarily pro wrestling. There's quite a bit of intersect between South Park fans and wrestling fans, because it basically appeals to the same base level. There are. This is a conversation we'll have way later, but wrestling fans are assholes. Okay.
Gee, I wonder why.
Wrestling fans are assholes.
People, do you think assholes might be attracted to violent media?
But it's like the only narratives that this audience sees about trans or gay people are the narratives that are presented by, for instance, South Park or WWE, where it's this very cartoonish, caricatured misrepresentation of something that they know nothing about. So much like you were saying about how they handled Mrs. Garrison's transition, there was no mention of Garrison being trans or even thinking they were trans until that episode.
Yeah.
It just happened out of nowhere, and that's not how this works.
And in the very same episode, she got gender reassignment surgery, didn't she?
That was the opening scene of the show.
So,
and people really need to stop giving graphic depictions of genital reassignments, especially incorrect ones like the one they did there, which I think was supposedly a castration of some animal. It was unnecessarily graphic.
Yeah.
And inaccurate.
And I think that also brings to mind another point, that transitioning is equated with gender reassignment surgery. That is, when you transition, or when you talk about transitioning, what you're talking about is getting your dick turned into a vagina or vice versa. And
that was literally the first thing my mom said to me when I attempted to come out to her.
Yeah, and I've had the same experience where I would just one of the first things I did as part of my social transition was changing my name on Facebook. And I had a family member when she asked me, well, what's with the new name change? And I basically said, well, I am experimenting with a more gender neutral persona. I think I used the word gender identity in there somewhere. I don't think I even used the word transition. The next thing she said was, I don't want you to rush into getting hormones or surgery. Just talking about changing my name on Facebook.
Yeah.
And the truth is, some trans people have hormones, some trans people have surgery, some trans people have both, but neither of those are necessary for a person to be transitioned. Sometimes it's just a matter of changing your name and or your pronouns, maybe changing the way you dress, cosmetic changes. And there can be a lot of different reasons for that. Sometimes a trans person is okay with how they look, and they don't necessarily want to change their body. Sometimes they have medical reasons that they couldn't undergo these changes, or they might not be able to afford it. Unfortunately, we don't have universal health care yet. And
we're Americans for our foreign audiences, so
Yeah.
yes, please feel bad for us. We're trying to get rid of the Cheeto too.
Oh yes, absolutely. Yes, pity us in our pathetic state of
In our
living.
near apocalypse.
So yeah, dispelling some misconceptions that are sometimes reinforced in the media. And we'll also be talking, I think, about some examples of really good trans representation in media.
And please feel free to send us
Oh yeah.
examples, because, see, I live under a rock, essentially. You're in the apartment now. You can see it's a...
Yeah, I'm looking straight up at the rock you live under.
So I'm pretty disconnected from like the new and hip. So anything you can point out to us would be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Mostly we'll be talking about like media that we have recommended to one another, but feel free to send us if there's something you would like us to talk about. Send us an email and we will consider it at very least.
Now, this might not be something we'd be able to do right away because we'd both have to familiarize ourselves with new media.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Don't take it personally if we don't get to it for a while.
So we'll also be talking about, we talked about South Park, which is a television show, and you mentioned pro wrestling. We're also going to be talking a bit about music, a little bit about video games, comics, books. Here's my basic take on what sorts of media I'm more familiar with. I have been a cheapskate my entire life. I come from a long line of cheapskates, a proud tradition of misers. So the media that I am most likely to actually consume is stuff that is available for free online. So I've read a lot of webcomics in my life. I watch a lot of YouTube. And I also have a lot of books that I have read in the library. So not so much in terms of video games, although there are some games that I like. Not so much in terms of television, because I do not have cable, and I haven't in my entire adult life.
Cable's kind of overrated anyway.
Yeah, it's definitely on its way out. And but even like paid subscription services like Hulu and Netflix, I'm not against them. I just haven't spent money on them. Although that might change as I get into this.
So I'm kind of more of the stereotypical nerd. Like
Really?
Sai is literally sitting next to a shelf of X-Men and Spider-Man and Superman and Power Ranger figures, whereas I'm sitting next to a shelf of basically everything Power Rangers you could imagine. Just to kind of give you an idea, this is just my living room, okay?
I see Ninja Turtles too.
Yes, there are some Ninja Turtles. I'm probably going to have a more extensive understanding, especially of like 90s cartoons and like I said, and sometimes I feel like I'm the dumbass among my friends because I am fortunate enough in my life right now to know a lot of educated people, which is not something I had 10 years ago when I was basically a small town drunk trying slowly to kill myself through alcoholism. So.
Yeah. Whereas I was raised by two college educated adults who kind of exposed me pretty early on to intellectual content. Whereas over time I've gotten in touch a little bit more with what you might call lowbrow culture that I think is like totally underrated because a lot of it is like in some way superior to the highbrow culture.
Right.
Curious. Have you seen the Sonic the Hedgehog movie trailer?
I saw the trailer. I was not interested in the Sonic the Hedgehog movie just to begin with. I was like, oh, they're making a Sonic the Hedgehog movie, and it was just like, shrug, you know. And then I saw that trailer, and I went from not caring about the movie to absolutely not wanting to have anything to do with it whatsoever. Why is this thing on my screen?
Yeah. I can't not have gotten exposed to some of that commentary. I've never played Sonic. I don't think I've watched any of the cartoons.
Okay.
But I know what Sonic is. And that thing in that trailer was not Sonic.
Yeah, you know what? At this point, if we're gonna do this, maybe I should make you watch the Super Mario Brothers movie.
Oh God! All right, sure, why not?
Oh no, you're actually gonna do it. Oh man.
Well, we don't have to, but
well, I don't know if like because you don't have the video game experience, you might not be as familiar with the Mario games. So the movie will just seem weird. Whereas for people that are familiar with Mario, holy shit, that movie.
I think
And
that,
it's not even a so bad it's funny movie. It's just really bad.
adaptations are a fascinating subject because they can be incredibly contentious. People who really loved the original media will inevitably know exactly what's different about the adaptation, and sometimes people confuse difference with the thing being worse.
Yeah.
But sometimes it genuinely is worse.
Sometimes it can be better.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And in fact, an example I'm going to throw out there is the Marvel Civil War comic event versus Captain America Civil War. You know, this may be a controversial opinion to about 3 of you, but I think we can all agree that the movie was far superior to the, oh my god, I can't believe that. Yeah, I think the movie executed the idea far better by taking out a lot of the elements that probably should have never been. We'll talk about this more when we do event comics. Event comics tend to try to shake up everything and change the status quo by shock value.
Kill a bunch of people.
Kill a bunch of people mostly, and
Replace them with slightly different people with similar costumes sometimes.
And the worst part of it is, especially in the modern comic book market or modern superhero comics, is they'll undo all of that with another event in like 6 months.
Yeah, that's I am not a huge superhero comics fan, but from what I've heard of it, the continuity is incredibly dense and incredibly convoluted.
Yeah.
And one thing I've read is that if you are trying to get into comics now, don't worry about reading up all the back issues of something. Just fill yourself in using Wikipedia or whatever, just because there is no hope of ever getting caught up.
I mean, don't be afraid to look into the stories you're interested in, but don't feel like you need to be a completionist because it's not going to help you.
Yeah. Yeah. Whereas I'm very much like, my mentality is very completionist. When I'm getting into something new, I want to start from the very beginning and go through the entire thing. And that's something that I've had to like overcome gradually over my life, especially as some of the things that I really like are things that, like long-running webcomics that have been going on for decades. Sometimes you just have to like start in the middle. And I think being able to fill yourself in as you go is a skill that's worth developing if you're interested in engaging with some of these long-running media. And that's why it's really great to have like the internet and Wikipedia. And it's also really helpful to have a really relaxed attitude towards spoilers.
Yeah.
I used to be militantly anti-spoiler, and I have since gone completely flipped that over and like realized if I try to avoid spoilers, I'll be avoiding most of the world.
Yeah.
Because it takes me a really long time to get to things sometimes. And sometimes knowing how something ends will change the experience of it for the better. Sometimes if something has a twist ending, knowing what that twist is going in will allow you to focus more on how the story is being told rather than trying to guess what's going to happen next when you're probably going to get it wrong anyway. I don't think there really is value in keeping yourself ignorant even about fiction.
Yeah.
How about you?
I think that people seem to get an erroneous idea that you can, you know, when you're able to watch something critically or to watch something with, you know, trying to find context or whatever else, you know, including when you know how it's going to end, so you know, so you can look for how they built to it. It goes back to something we were saying like at the beginning of this, where people don't want to think about what they're consuming.
Yes, they just, I think that there are a couple of different ways to consume something. And like one of those ways is to just sit back in your chair and let it wash over your brain and stimulate whatever emotional response.
And there is a value
absolutely.
to that.
But I also think that you can do that while still thinking about it. Or you don't have to necessarily need a clean slate in your brain before you can let those emotional responses happen. And a good example of this is music. Because I don't think anybody has an idea that you could spoil a song. Except maybe if you like played it over and over again all day and got sick of it.
Yeah.
But not in the sense that you have too much knowledge in your brain about that song and now you can't like. I think most people experience music as getting better as you listen to it over and over again.
Right. Because
you get to notice more. There is a kind of satisfaction you can get from singing along or drumming along or just knowing it very well. Eventually being able to like have it running in your head when it's not when you don't even have a recording with you. And I can sometimes feel that exact same way about fiction because I love rereading things or rewatching things. I will get like all the beats down and there are comic strips that I used to read where I would read them so many times that I could just look at the pictures and not even have to wear my glasses because I didn't have to read the speech bubbles because I already knew the speech bubbles by heart. And it's just a matter of like going over those well-worn paths in my brain. And there's definitely value in that.
A good example about how I handle spoiler, I guess you call it spoiler culture, is this latest season of Game of Thrones. Now, I was a person that really got into the show when it first came out. And there was one thing that happened about 2 seasons ago that felt to me like it stopped being the books and started becoming TV. I guess is a way of putting it. And the thing about Game of Thrones is it's merciless.
Oh, yes,
I've
heard.
It destroys everything. And not in the same way that South Park does. I mean, it's like the moment, characters, they have no problem killing off a character in an extreme or brutal way. They have no problem dashing all your hopes for a happy ending. And that's just a running theme both in the Song of Ice and Fire books as well as the show that's based on it. But the last 2 seasons, there has been no book. So now it's TV writers writing TV shows. And there is a difference. And there is one particular instance at the end of season 6 where I feel like that difference makes itself known. And it's in the Battle of the Bastards. Ramsay Snow is this horrible, despicable, evil thing. He is a bastard, hence the last name Snow.
Okay.
And he is able to get himself legitimized by his father as Ramsay Bolton by being a murderous, evil fuck.
Okay.
And in a truly contemptuous way. This is somebody who was nothing, had nothing go for him. He had no skills. He had no personality worth a damn. He's an ugly motherfucker. This guy only accumulated power because the right kids happened to be smaller than him. And so, in what's called the Battle of the Bastards, you have Ramsay Bolton versus Jon Snow. Ramsay's army is like 6 times the size the one that Jon's bringing. But Ramsay wasn't happy with having the numbers advantage or the tactical advantage. He had to dick with Jon Snow. Send his brother running after him and killing him just as his brother was within his finger's reach. Which goaded him into straight on taking on this massive army and almost getting himself killed as well as the rest of his army. His sister rides in with an alliance she made with another kingdom, ends up saving Jon Snow's ass. So it finally comes down to it's this fist fight between Jon Snow and Ramsay. And you would think, oh, it's going to be this long, prolonged battle, right? Well, this is Game of Thrones. The end of the first season, they killed the hero of the series. Spoilers! Ned Stark dies.
Wow.
And so it's like, I'm used to this show being like, okay, there's a thing you would normally see in the fantasy genre. We're not going to do that. And so, where you would have, like in Lord of the Rings, it would be this grand final battle, Jon Snow just punches the shit out of him. Like a punk. It's like 3 or 4 punches to the face, he presumably beats him to death. Like the punk-ass bitch he is. And then, the writers come back later and it's like, oh no, they're gonna have Ramsay fed to his feral dogs instead. And this is supposed to be the cute and poetic and literary ending. This is the grand irony. The grand irony was getting punked out like a bitch, punched in the face 3 times by a man you taunted with the death of his brother. And then you tack on this TV writing. And it's just like, oh.
Everything has to be a visual spectacular or very graphic rather than simple.
And the thing is, it's not even about it being simple. It's about a poetic death would have served Ramsay's motivations. Mm-hmm. Because he wanted power and infamy.
Right, yeah. And like, there's a sort of insult to be made by not even giving someone the dignity of treating them like dog food. The last thing a megalomaniacal narcissist wants is to be treated like he's common.
Mm.
Even
See, that's the poetry.
And even by his enemies.
Mm-hmm.
That's why, like, you're not allowed to have a moderate opinion of, say, Donald Trump. Everybody is either, in his mind, his best friend or his worst enemy.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody just thinks he's kind of dumb and doesn't deserve to be president, you know?
I think the kind of dumb and doesn't deserve to be president part's kind of just, you know, it's like air.
Yeah, it's
you know,
you don't have to hate the guy's guts
mm-hmm.
to think that someone else would have been vastly superior.
And almost anyone would have been vastly better.
Yeah, like say a moderate Republican who didn't like Trump is like a traitor, you know?
Yeah.
Whereas, dude, you're not that important. I mean, you're only important because you have power, not because you're inherently special.
So, and this is what we mean by greater context in fiction.
Yes.
You know, it's like living in that spoiler culture. Now it's kind of like, you know what? I'm kind of glad that I'm going to probably find out about stuff before I see it, because part of it is at least I know what to expect.
Yeah.
And then, you know, there's also well, if it's really disappointing, okay, I can avoid it.
Yeah. That's something I kind of, like, find frustrating about modern media culture, is especially with very popular media. Like the latest video game movie. You can't just not pay attention to the production news and stuff like that. Like I said, I never played Sonic as a kid. I am not I don't even really watch a lot of movies. The movies I do watch tend to be more like thoughtful, intellectual stuff.
Right.
Although I did really love Black Panther. But I still haven't seen Captain Marvel. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of sometimes I'll watch the movies, but usually I don't. But I can't avoid knowing that there's going to be a Sonic movie and that it's horrifyingly animated and that...
Well, I mean, if you saw the trailer, you kind of figured that part out.
Yeah. But I knew that people hated that trailer. The way that I found out that there was going to be a Sonic movie was finding out that people hated the trailer. That's the kind of thing, that's the kind of world we're living in right now.
Right.
Is that you can't escape the commentary. You cannot escape the reactions. You get, like, if you're not paying attention to, like, the front lines of the trailers and the release schedules and stuff like that, you'll just be going about your business, and this wave of social media responses will just crash into your and you'll be like, oh, is that what we're talking about today? I guess that's what we're talking about today. So there really is no way to go into, say, a movie theater or open a book, at least not something that's very popular, and not have all of these ideas in your head about what you're about to see. My first real taste of that was being a Harry Potter fan while the Harry Potter books were coming out. At no time before then did people get so hyped up over an upcoming book. There was all this speculation of, oh, who's going to die in this one? Little bits and pieces would just get leaked out. People were circulating this, like, grainy image of a page of a leaked copy of one of the books. And they printed that picture in a newspaper, and everyone was, like, trying to make out, like, individual words in that picture. And having opinions about it. And getting really emotionally invested in it before, like, months before it would come out. And to be, like, I was a teenager and / in my early 20s when this was going on. So it was really hard to be, like, young enough to be really enthusiastic about my favorite book series, and also, like, subjected to this very distracting. I couldn't just put it out of my mind for a couple of years while waiting for the next book to come out. You just can't.
Right.
So, yeah, so that's kind of the media landscape we're living in. We can't not talk about these things, so we may as well talk about them.
Yeah, I have a little bit of experience with the Sonic games. I played them a little bit when I was younger, like when, the first 2 Sonic games I have a lot of memory of playing. I was never very good at them. They were basically Mario but faster. And people will just say that I've said something very blasphemous by doing that, but I was never very good at the game anyway, so blaspheme away. But I was familiar with the one cartoon series where they sort of built this lore about Sonic and a group of rebels fighting against the evil Dr. Robotnik that was turning the natural world into a giant robot city. That's about as far as I ever got with it. But I am aware that it got, I guess the word would be weirder. So it's like I'm not attached in a way to this property or to this trailer, but I did see it, and I went from apathetic, like whatever, to wow, I just don't want anything to do with this.
Yeah.
And the last time I felt that way about a movie trailer was the Ghostbusters reboot.
Interesting.
The trailer turned me off to the movie, but the reception after the movie actually came out turned me around on it.
Really?
Yeah. It's like, once I saw that people who actually saw the movie were like, oh, it's not that bad. Okay. And I go and see it, and it's not that bad.
See, I had a very different response to the Ghostbusters, and that has a lot to do with my personal life.
Mm-hmm.
So the Ghostbusters reboot came out the summer before I came out as trans. So I was still living as a woman. I, like I said, a very feminist woman. And I already knew about the anti-feminist movement on the internet.
And it was... Yeah. It was part of why I kind of felt bad for not enjoying the trailer. Like, yeah, it's like, I don't want to be associated with these people, but they might have a point. And then, of course, obviously they didn't, but, I
was also, at the time, and this really ties into the timing of my coming out as well, I was going through a divorce. I had a very brief but very intense marriage. When I saw the Ghostbusters reboot in theaters, it was while my divorce was pending in the courts, basically. It was also the first movie I ever saw in the theater alone. It really meant a lot to me to be seeing this movie that was explicitly female. Not only that, but feminizing a story that was before then extremely masculine. And feeling something good about being a woman for possibly the last time. And also, like, just being able to enjoy something in spite of all the people in the world saying that it was bad because of it being feminine.
Which I think we both agree that's not true.
Yeah. I really loved that movie. It was also the first movie that I saw with my girlfriend. Own it on DVD. And
Same here.
And I think one of the reasons I really loved it is because I didn't expect it to be anything like the original. I did like the original Ghostbusters. It was a really good movie.
Yeah.
It was funny. It was fun. It had some really amazing scenes in it. But the reboot was very, very different in terms of the kind of story it was telling, the kind of themes it was dealing with. Similar to what I was saying before about adaptations. Sometimes people mistake something being different from the original with it being worse.
Right.
I also have, like, some ideas about, like, some of the critical responses to the Ghostbusters reboot. I think only count as criticisms if you are missing out on what kind of story is being told here.
And going back to an earlier point that people don't want to think about their media.
Yeah, absolutely. They're like, and yeah, the original was very surface level. It was it didn't have a lot of deep themes, at least not that were, like, readily, like, accessible. And it was funny, it was actiony, it had some special effects, but it was not, like, based on that. And it was very much a character-based comedy. Whereas the reboot was very actiony. It had a lot of drama in terms of, like, the interpersonal dynamics involved.
It seemed more story-driven.
It was very story-driven, and it dealt with the individual backstories of the characters much more so than the original. And it also had a team that was more diverse in terms of, yes, we still had 3 white Ghostbusters and 1 black Ghostbuster, and yet there was also a much greater diversity of neurotypes. For instance, I personally believe that Holtzman was at very least coded autistic, if not actually autistic.
Right.
Whereas the original didn't deal with a whole lot of unusual characters in the main cast.
Yeah.
They were all basically dudes.
Yeah.
You had your womanizing dude, you had your intellectual scientist dude, you had your kind of goofball dude who didn't really know what he was doing, and you had the black guy.
Right.
Who was like a blue-collar guy who just wanted a job.
Yeah. And we're not saying that there's anything particularly wrong with having this.
Yeah.
It's I think that something that gets lost when we talk about diversity is this concept of forced diversity, where it's like, you have to have a woman, you have to have a black person, you have to have a Latino or whatever, and you're just trying to fill quotas, like the stupid bullshit reason why people hate on affirmative action, which is racist and stupid, because it's not about quotas, it's about evening the playing field.
And also, like, people complain about forced diversity, but I don't see a lot of people in those camps complaining about forced homogeneity.
Yeah.
Because, like, when the fact that almost all popular media has been dominated with male main characters and male supporting characters and male extras and occasionally a female love interest.
Occasionally. I might be misappropriating this term, but it's almost like a cultural gentrification.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think so.
And we're pushing back against that idea, and certain people, young white men are opposed to that because they were raised by old white men who were used to being entitled to the world.
Yep.
And these young men have been fed this lie And now that they're growing up in a world where they're not the entitled, coddled hierarchy, they're mad. They're mad because they feel that they've been betrayed by society. You're forcing us into this. No, you're in a society, okay? There are 7 billion people on this planet, roughly.
But more than
Okay, more. All right, but there's what 500 million people in America alone, and that's.
I think the last number I read was 300 million, but for all I know, we've grown since then.
Okay, I'm just.
I don't know what the birth rate is.
I'm throwing out crazy numbers here. They're probably not accurate at all. My point is, you're sharing this world with an increasingly diverse number of people, not because of media representation. It's because, well, quite frankly, it's because of the internet.
And I think also because the cost of like actually making media has gone way down. Neither of us is wealthy, but we have access to the technology to put together this podcast and put it out on the internet. It used to be that if you wanted to like talk about the media you enjoy to millions of people in the world,
you had to be somebody creating that media.
Yeah, you had to be. Maybe you could get a radio show in your local radio station, but you would still only be reaching people in your local area. And even that, it requires a lot of expensive equipment. And nowadays, you can get started making media that can reach anybody in the world with very, very little. I'm not gonna lie. There is still a capital threshold in terms of you got to have internet access. That costs money. You got to have computer. That costs money. You have to have recording equipment. That costs money. But it costs way less than it used to. And also the skills required to you can learn those skills using tutorials that are generally available for free online. Not necessarily, you can't necessarily become an expert using only those, but like if you put in the work, definitely. We're seeing minorities getting behind the wheel of their own media franchises and their own media production teams and making their own movies, their own TV shows, their own cartoons, their own games. And of course, they're going to put characters in there that they relate to. You're seeing more women in video games in part because there's more women making video games. You're seeing more black people in movies that aren't stereotypes because there are more black people making movies and writing them and directing them and casting them. And that's good. That is amazing. And I think that what we're seeing with the response is that some people think that if there are more minorities in the media, then there's going to be less of the straight cis white guys. And no, there's the total amount of media being made is going way, way up. There used to be 3 TV channels.
Yeah, now there's like 5 billion.
And there used to be like a couple of big movie studios. And if you weren't one of those studios, you weren't making movies. Or you might be making extremely low budget art movies that maybe if you were really lucky, you could get into one of those film festivals. But if you're a film festival movie, you're not going to reach a wide audience.
Whereas if you post your stuff on YouTube,
oh yeah,
it's a completely different marketplace.
Absolutely.
And I was actually really active on YouTube about 10-15 years ago when it first started. And I actually have a lot of bad experiences with that, unfortunately. I fell in with YouTube atheism, which unfortunately turned into a sexist nightmare.
I'm sorry about that.
Yeah. So I eventually fell out of that. Quite frankly, these days, I'm probably a deist.
Which is about as close you can get to atheism while still believing in God.
Believing in a concept of God, anyway. It's a long, complicated conversation that we won't do today to spare you.
Yes. Although it would be interesting to have a talk about religion sometime, maybe in the context of one of our other conversations. Religiously, I was raised Unitarian Universalism, which is one of those hippy-dippy churches that don't necessarily make you believe in anything, but there's a shared set of values, and you go to church and sing hymns that have the word God like scribbled out.
I was raised evangelical.
Ah, beautiful.
Yeah, that's a way of putting it.
And nowadays, my religious beliefs are all over the place. It's kind of an eclectic, Christo-pagan, Buddhist nonsense witch kind of person. I don't know.
Right.
Come at me if you think that that's a contradiction in terms, because, yeah, of course it's a contradiction in terms. We're called false dichotomies.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of contradiction involved. We as trans people are living contradictions, in a sense.
Absolutely. Again, we are Cy Castells.
And Daria Quinn. Well, thank you for spending your time with us, and hopefully you got something from this.
Looking forward to going on this journey with you, Daria.
I appreciate it. Thank you. I'm looking forward to this as well.
Thanks a lot.